vigilante parade, you get one of these little nice little packets. If you participate in the parade, if you build a float or whatever you might do, and you participate, and then you send me action shots. And I don't want you just standing there. I want you like working, constructing, building. I'll give you not a lot, a little bit of extra credit. Or if you're in the band and you're marching and I get an action shot, once again, not just you standing there. I want a dramatic shot of you. I'll give you a little extra credit. The parade is May 1st. That's not right to everybody?
Yeah.
All right. So Thursday, the last day, we are over 60. Where? What? Where? Sorry. We are over 60 floats right now. There's a lot of people doing. Last year was good parade. We had a lot of very good floats. Okay, so where do we finish it here? Did we get to Dachau? Hey, what is it called? Living space. The German term and part of Nazi ideology. Oh, first off, what was Hitler's book? And what's living space? He's talking about war in the East. What was the German word for that? Living space, part of Nazi ideology. Everyone, quick go check if you don't know. Quick. Turning it. Yeah, Lebensraum. Yeah, Lebensraum. Living space. He's already talking about war in the East as early as 1923. And who was the #1 scapegoat? Because Jews were behind every problem. But what was their mortal enemy that would help get into power? What group? Communists and socialists. And they could not unify. So conservatives freaked out. I think that's why we got right there. We got the Reichstag fire. We got the doc. Okay, let's get going then. Because we are a little behind, which is always, so we got nailing app, electric. Oh, we got to the electric fences, yeah. So, by 1934, they had banned every major political party, and they would still have elections, but we call the elections a plebiscite. And if you ever heard of that term, it just basically means up or down, yes or no election. Vote for the Nazis or not. And so here's one. This is your ballot. Remember the ballot I showed you before at 8? Now it has 1. And they put all the main leaders of the party. And I love this one. Yeah for Hitler. Tiny one. And he would get, one choice. There would be a couple percent would vote against, but everyone would vote for it. And Hitler is going to turn out to be very popular in Germany for a while. We'll get to the reason why in just one second. Now, this goes back to the 1920s. The ground troops, originally called Sports Battalion, SA. Oh, we didn't know they were called stormtroopers. They named them after the World War I specially trained assault battalions from 1918. They found a bunch of cheap brown uniforms that were supposed to go to German colonial Africa, so they called them the brown shirts. And that's why you see Hitler always, a lot of the pictures, if you see a color one, it's almost always in a brown or kind of tan uniform. That's the legacy of it. These were the street fighters of the Nazis. They would brawl with communists in the streets of Berlin. They would attack Jewish-owned shops. I mean, the Nazis were gangsters and thugs and hooligans. And after Hitler took power, eventually there'd be over 400,000 stormtroopers. Now, remember, their army was only 100,000. And Hitler felt like he was losing control, especially the leader, a guy named Ernst Röhm right there. And in 1934, right, we'll get right here. It's going to be called the Night of the Long Knives. On January 30th, but the execution went on to the 2nd, Hitler got rid of all the leadership of the SS, the stormtroopers, had them all killed. In fact, he helped personally storm the quarters of Ernst Röhm, who was a close ally. And here's a picture, a British cartoon of them. And basically, Hitler has decided, yes, they're my allies, but they're gaining too much. He wanted to make sure anybody who was strong within the Nazi hierarchy gone. And Stalin watched this. And 2 years later, he would do the exact same thing to get rid of all the hierarchy of the Bolsheviks, what's known as the Purge. Followed Hitler. The two so-called mortal enemies were in reality very close in totalitarianism. Stalin was horrible and Hitler was beyond comprehension bad. Now, the SS wasn't directly under Hitler's control. So he created a group back in the 1920s called the Staatsstüffel, the SS. And this would become a very big and corrupt group. They were the concentration guards, the brutal concentration guards, and the Waffen-SS were soldiers. And by 1943, they're going to get the best equipment and the best pick of recruits. They weren't very well led, but they were fanatical. And here you can see Hitler. Hitler was in just a second reviewing them. That's two-stepping. Kick them the leg out. And a lot of honor guards would do that style of march. And this goes back to this 18th century. But goon-stepping became personified by Nazis. That and jackboots, those big high leather boots. The leader of the SS, a horrific toady of a man by the name of Heinrich Himmler, right here. And he was the architect of the mass murder of the millions. Oh, Hitler was behind it all. Now, he picked a horrible man to do it. They just let him do it. This evil man. It's hard to even describe Himmler. And corrupt beyond belief. Of course, remember what I told you. Authoritarians are always corrupt. In Hungary, they just ousted their kind of authoritarian dictator Orban in an election. And the big reason he was ousted was corruption, which is so corrupt. So the secret police in Germany would be called the Gestapo. So you ever heard that? That's the secret police. A lot of people confuse them or think they're like the SS. They're related to. This is actually, this is one of these interesting pictures. When I was a kid, German Shepherds were associated with Nazi Germany too. Or dogs. Just dogs. Berlin police, stormtrooper. And these were the secret police. And this is their headquarters in Berlin, where thousands would be arrested. And in the basement, the cells here would be infamous torture cells, where prisoners would be brought down and confessions would be extracted from them. And they'd be sent off to the concentration camp. And this was one of the most horrific spots in all of Germany. It was destroyed in heavy bombing and then fighting in March through April of 1945. And it remained a ruin all the way through the Cold War. After the Cold War ended and Germany was reunified, they turned this into one of the most amazing museums I've ever been to. The whole building, the top is gone, just was blown away. All that's left are the cells that were in the basement. There's no room anymore, it's just the cells. And it's a museum they call it the Topography of Terror. And I always wanted to go when, I heard all about it, wanted to go. And I went there and it's tough, but it's also one of the best museums. If you get a chance to go to Berlin, go to it. It's really worth it. A lot of great things in Berlin. That was amazing. But that's what the Gestapo. But what got Hitler's popularity was massive public works, huge buildings, construction, dams. You had labor battalions, and they would do these kind of show marches, but they were young men who, unlike military precision, but they're working. Remember, Germany had over 30% unemployment. Within 3 years, the unemployment had dropped to less than 5%. Here is a building. Now it's an art school. Then it was the Air Force headquarters, the Luftwaffe. These big, massive granite buildings and cement. Hitler liked that style of architecture. It's really ugly, but they're there because they're almost impossible to destroy. So it's kind of weird going into that museum and it's an art school. Just a weird thing going to the front foyer. It's just interesting. And of course, the most famous would be the highway system, the freeway system that the interstate highway system would copy 20 years later. It's an amazing road network. And this was Keynesian economics in a way. Now, Keynesian was a Democrat, small d Democrat. He's British. He's not, I'm not talking party here. But Hitler adopted these tactics. Not completely. The Nazis were so corrupt that money was funneled up to the top, but it gave Germans the feeling that they're out of the Depression and getting out of the shadow of Versailles and the humiliation of World War I. So here are a couple pictures. You'll Hitler doing the I'm working, and there are workers. The interesting scene going on the Autobahn. And then I found this little GIF. I just found this interesting. Is it GIF or GIF? I think it's GIF, isn't it? You going with GIF? Hitler going down the Autobahn. By the way, there's parts of the Autobahn with no speed limit, and it is an interesting place to drive. That's the fastest I've ever driven, 16 miles an hour. That's probably going 100. And I got passed. Thank you. That is a weird thing, being passed when you're going 100. And I was driving that fast and looking back at it, that was crazy. So, see the picture? You notice the median, you know what a freeway looks like. 7 years later, here's another picture of the Autobahn. This is in Western Germany. I don't know what that is. That's an American Sherman tank and US forces going east, and those all the German field levels. That's Nazi Germany. I thought that was a good picture to put in there, and it's less than a decade from that. The height of German popularity. And the idea was to make Germans, not anybody, those others, not the others, but Germans life better. So, for example, Hitler personally approved a cheap, easy, efficient car that they would begin making. The idea would be that German people would buy stamps, and when you fill up the stamp book, you got a car. And it was going to be for the people. So they called it the People's Wagon. What's the People's Wagon? Volkswagen. And that's the first Volkswagen. So if you ever see a Volkswagen Beetle, that was Hitler's car that he approved for the people of Germany. Cheap, easy to make, and had little things to save money and weight. So, for example, the trunk is in front, the gas tank is right there, the engine's in back. Which means if you ever got into a collision, like an accordion, so they're really dangerous things, and also blew up. But after the war, they never actually made these for the people because the war began. After the war, they still had all the machine tools made, and to try to get the German economy going again, they just started making these cars. And they became kind of a hit in the late 1950s. Cheap, efficient cars, as opposed to the big boats that you could buy in the United States today. And here's the German unemployment rate. And so Hitler almost certainly will be the most popular leader Germany had ever or will ever have. 1926. Fade. But he made people feel like the economy is getting better. It's a Nazi miracle. And that's the most popular propaganda poster. That's one that would be used all over. So, indoctrination of kids when they're young. This is for all girls join the Hitler Youth. You notice this idealized boy, but the only face that matters here. And then women have lots of German children. That became their role. In fact, in Nazi Germany, women were not expected to work. Even when men went off to war in every other country, women took jobs that men had, not in Nazi Germany. Their economy was so inefficient, which is once again, they almost won. And even though they took power by anti-communism, the anti-Jewish propaganda would be huge in Nazi Germany. Here, these horrible caricatures. Der Stürmer was the Nazi newspaper. The editor would be executed after the war. That is from Der Stürmer. And even though concentration camps credit, it wasn't for Jews, but in 1934, we got to get this law. One of the most important laws in history called the Nuremberg laws. the Nuremberg laws. And that was to deprive Jews of their rights. Now, there's actually going to be a few different versions of this, but the whole goal, of course, and now Jews only made up 1% of the population of Germany. Most of them tried to assimilate as German, whatever that might mean, culturally as possible. But the idea was to force them to leave. And by 1939, over half did. Unfortunately, for those people who fled Germany, they forced them to pay a bunch of taxes, meaning they lost almost everything they had. And most countries would not take them. The United States would not. Of course not. The United States just passed the National Origins Act. He didn't let any Jewish people in there, except for a few scientists. Most had to go to Poland or Lithuania. I think you already know what's going on. So these are stormtroopers here. They're harassing Jewish-owned stores. But 1936, Hitler or Nazi Germany had the Olympics. The Olympics had just started 40 years earlier, the modern Olympics. One thing about the first Olympics, it happened in Athens in 1896. Silver was first place. Silver, which it seems so weird today. And also one more thing in this Olympics, some of the competitions were art. So it had a couple different painting ones for a gold medal, which I find fascinating. Architecture, literature gold medal, a poetry gold medal, which is interesting to me. Got rid of those after the World War II. And this was really going to be Hitler's showpiece to show the superiority of the Nazi ideology in the Germanic people. And I should say this, Germans did really well. Really well, almost doubled all the other countries in medals, even architecture. But one American did do very well. Jesse Owens won 3 gold medals, relay 100, 200 meter. There he is at the 100 meter. And I just find this fascinating. So Japanese athlete got 3rd, the German got 2nd. And this is going to go, especially after the war, about how this humiliated Hitler. Hitler was no more humiliated by this than any other time that the Germans lost. It was no different, but the United States we want to be kind of special. But got to remember, Jesse Owens, when he went back to the United States, he was a second-class citizen. And so the United States would try to use this for propaganda during the war and after the war for reason to fight. But Owens got back and he still had to face Jim Crow and segregation. In fact, to make a living, Jesse Owens had to race horses. Here is our do these humiliating actions to try to make a little bit of extra money. So the United States has their own issues to deal with. Now, that did not mean that there's any comparison, no. Significantly more far-sighted, but still, we have to do a lot here too. So let's get to the road to World War II. The very fast version of the road to war. And these are German forces tearing down the road barrier to Poland, September 1st, 1939. So here's Germany, and this is German propaganda implying we are outnumbered by all these enemies, and we just have 100,000 men from the Treaty of Versailles. Well, remember the League of Nations? It was weak. It was going to be created to try to stop war collectively, collective security. Remember Article 10 and 11. But the U.S. never joined. And in reality, collective security was always flawed. Are people really going to go to war to stop aggression in an area that's not their own country? Now, there are a couple efforts. There are a bunch of these treaties, 2 we need to know, to try to have arms control and to limit the hell of war. The ones that have been on test before, the Washington Naval Conference. It limited the number of capital ships, battleships. It limited the number of battleships. These are ratios. The British and the US, for every 5 battleships they have, Japan will have 3, Italy and France will have 1.67. It's a ratio. They did not cut off a third of a ship. That's not conceivable. And they limited the size to about 45,000 tons. For example, the US were building 2 battleships and they got the hull done and they just put a flat top on and made them air. For example, Lexington and the Saratoga. And Japan was angry by this, but actually gave them an advantage. The US and the British have a lot. The US has 2 seas to protect. Britain has a whole empire. Japan, just the Western Pacific. The other one was called, they would eventually, that treaty would be ignored in the late 1900s. The Kellogg-Briand Pact. Kellogg was the American Secretary of State, Briand, French Foreign Minister. And it basically tried to make war illegal, saying all war of aggression will be banned. Anyone who signed it will agree to no more war of aggression. And I put this up there because it shows the futility of these kind of efforts. How are you going to make war illegal? What are you going to do? Have the Swiss police come and arrest you if you attack somebody? I was thinking those comical European sirens, and arresting and taking you away. What? How do you stop war of aggression besides war? And so they're trying to come up with a way to make war not happen, but it showed how futile it was, especially in the 1930s. So out of the roots of the Great Depression, in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. So Manchuria right here, and they made a puppet government called Manchukuo. China was in this long civil war, so weakened. The army did it. The civilian government back in Tokyo did not order this. And it ended the civilian government basically. They just invaded from the colony of Korea. And the League did nothing. Here are Japanese forces entering Mukden, the capital. And in 1937, they attacked China, hoping to get a few basically concessions from China. It turned into a horrific war of attrition for 8 years. And here's Japan blowing through all the treaties. The League did nothing. So what could they do? Did anybody really want to go fight and die for Manchuria if you were, let's say, from Britain or France, or for that matter, the US? Then, in 1935 and into 36, Italy brutally invaded Abyssinia, which today we call Ethiopia, one of the 2 remaining independent countries of Africa. They tried to take it 30 years, 40 years earlier and failed. Here are Italian forces they hastily put up propaganda picture of Mussolini. So Italy's trying to reestablish the glories of Rome, and the League did nothing. And this is, Italy even used mustard gas against the ill-equipped Ethiopian forces who fought with great bravery, but Italy had modern equipment, modern forces. And here is France and Britain going to Mussolini. That's bad, but did nothing. Man, the horrific civil war in Spain, 1936 to 1939, and they're still in the shadow of this civil war today. If you go to Barcelona and you'll still see it. In fact, Barcelona was just hinting at leaving Spain. So it goes back to this, a horrific civil war. That thousands would be killed and butchered and break Spain. It would not recover. There are 2 different sides. One is called the Republican or the Popular Front. And add this, they were anti-fascist. And it's a confusing poster. Thousands of people joined them, including over 8,000 Americans went and fought for them in what they call the Abraham Lincoln Brigade against fascism. These are some of the Americans who fought there. But they were poorly equipped and poorly trained, but enthusiastic. A little bit of help from the Soviets, but the Soviets tried to extort stuff. You can see them anti-Franco, but they show a swastika. And then those who tried to overthrow their democracy would be called the nationalists. And they were basically fascists. Their leader was a general by the name of Francisco Franco, right here. Here they are sweeping away the socialists. And they weren't as many, but they had the bulk of the trained forces. But here's the biggie. Here's the biggie. They had German and Italian. Over 50,000 Italians fought, were volunteered by Mussolini. And the Germans sent troops and planes. Here are Italian bombers. Okay, by the time World War II began, they were obsolete, but in 1936, very modern, Italian forces. And the Germans, who were secretly building an air force, were using planes such as this. It's a dive bomber called the Stuka. Some of you might have heard of that. But they couldn't have the regular German cross. Notice that? Kind of like the Free Corps. They called them the Condor Legion. Be kind of a training ground where they would brutally attack Spanish cities. And in 1939, the nationalists won, the fascists won. And the fascists would be in power in Spain until 1976. And it gave the feeling that fascism's on the rise, that fascism was the new and modern government and democracies were weak, especially when Britain and France did nothing. And of course, the United States did nothing. Here's Franco after the war. Here are Republicans being taken away. Thousands would be tortured to death for fighting on the side of the Republicans. This Spain will go through hell. And it still has this issue broken by this war. So here's one of the most important events of the pre-war era. One of the most important is taking of the Rhine. March 1936. So let me explain what happened here. In the Treaty of Versailles, it said this area along the Rhine River, it's Germany, but they can't have troops, aka it's demilitarized, as a buffer between Germany and France and Belgium. In 1936, Hitler ordered it to be militarized. Now his army was still tiny. He secretly increased it to nearly 300,000 men, but France had over 2.5 million men. France had a great army. Britain did not. Britain had a tiny army. Here they are marching in. Hitler, though, was scared to death. I put down nervous, and I didn't know what else to put. He ordered his generals, if the French do anything, retreat. So here they are crossing the bridge at Remagen, or Cologne, Remagen, entering German towns. So this is part of Germany, but it's against the treaty. But what did France and Britain do? Nothing. And that's what we got to get, nothing. Actually, France kind of wanted to do something. They thought, oh God, we got to stop them. But the British refused to help. And the French were scared to go at it alone, which the French should have. And the British made a very good argument. Why should we go fight if the Germans are putting troops in Germany? They're not invading. This is Germany. Let them have it. It's not, what's the big deal? They'll move troops in. A terrible mistake. This was probably the only time they could have stopped Hitler before all the events that led to World War II. And this would become known as a peace. Giving into aggression. Giving into aggression. If they would have moved in, Hitler would have retreated, and it would have been such a humiliating defeat that Hitler might not have recovered. The army was very distrustful of Hitler. But he was right. They did it. And after this, Hitler started conscription. We call it the draft, and began to rebuild the army. That's going to take a really long time, but they began to rebuild. And here they are, goose stepping over the treaties and goose stepping into the Rhine. That would have been the moment. And so with that, Hitler and Mussolini, who actually didn't really trust each other at first, became closer in what's known as the Rome-Berlin axis. There's Mussolini and Hitler, and their main organizing principle, anti-communism. Now, it's not a full-fledged alliance, but that is where you're going to get the countries fighting, or the United States, the United Nations would fight, would be called the Axis. Now, it seemed like Mussolini was relatively equal, but it's very clear that Italy was way behind in so many ways. And this allowed Hitler to do something, once again, violating the Treaty of Versailles. It's going to be called Anschluss. March 1938. Germany unified with Austria. Germany unified with Austria. These maps are not cheap. They're really expensive. Map of World War II is the cheapest thing I've ever seen. It's terrible. It's big arrows with policy, but they unify with Austria. It's amazing how much they spend on these maps. But they entered Austria. There was a big anti-fascist bloc in Austria, but they were kind of overwhelmed. There's not really a fight. They just entered it and unified it. And so here's Germans and Austrians, and it says, Mein Volk, Ein Reich, Ein Führer. I showed you that on Friday. And one of the first things that Hitler ordered a tiny group of SS officers to do is when they got to Salzburg. Salzburg is right on the border right there. That's where Hitler was before World War I. And he had fled Austria for World War I because he was trying to avoid the Austrian draft of their empire. Part of his whole aura was his spectrum, a war hero. And so they went in and destroyed all the records of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that might have his draft records in showing how he was draft dodging. Those strange little quirks of fate. So the League did nothing. Now it's probably too late, but then he turned his sights to Czechoslovakia. So one of these new democratic republics, even though it had some problems, this area right here was called the Sudetenland. And this goes back to the old Austrian Empire. It had German-speaking people there, a German-speaking minority. And Hitler said that they were being mistreated. And they lived in the Carpathian Mountains, which have very elaborate defenses. These are some of the forts that still remain from the Czechoslovakian army. The Czechs had a powerful army. It was smaller than Germany, but it was a strong country. And they were going to fight. And they had a defense alliance with Britain and France. And they were going to fight. And Hitler said, if they're not turned over, if Sudetenland's not turned over, I must defend Germans, and we will go to war. Well, the Western Allies absolutely can. After the Rhineland, they kind of finally realized, well, we might actually have war. Now here is the leaders, it's Daladier and Chamberlain, France, Britain, saying we'll fight. But did they really mean it? That's supposed to be Neville Chamberlain to get through the world crisis, especially the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Neville Chamberlain was desperate to try to maintain peace. And his thought was, we're not ready for war. Do we really want to fight and die for Czechoslovakia? Talk about Brits. 2 different times. In fact, the first time he ever flew on a plane, he would go to Munich to meet with Hitler. And in 1938, did I put down the year? Did I give you the year 1938? I'm sorry if I didn't. 4 men met to decide the fate of Czechoslovakia and arguably the world. Hitler of Germany, Mussolini showed up, and Mussolini could speak French and English, so he acted like the translator. He's not the guy you want as a translator. And he can strut around. Here he is. Chamberlain of Britain and Daladier, the Premier of France. It's not there. He's not there. Czechoslovakia was not there. Stalin was not there. And of course, the US is out of it. These 4 are going to decide the fate of Czechoslovakia and war. And they did. This will become, when everybody talks about appeasement after the war, Munich. Now, it was too late. The big example of appeasement was the Rhineland. Let me get to the last thing here. They announced Hitler can have the Sudetenland. And here it is showing Chamberlain and Mussolini, and it all smiles. And then Chamberlain said, the Prime Minister of Britain, okay, you get the Sudetenland, how about we do this? Hitler would agree, that's all he wants. He signed the paper, said he agrees, that's it, that's all he wants. In fact, that's Hitler signing right there. Sure. Would you agree that you're not going to demand anything else? And Hitler's like, yeah, give me a piece of paper, I'll sign it. But by this, of course, he actually was mad. He kind of wanted more, despite what his general said. But this will become the test case of the peace. Don't forget who wasn't there. The Czechs were betrayed. Stalin was furious. He didn't like Britain and France, but he knew Germany was their mortal enemy. The building where they meet is a school now today. You can go up. The office where Hitler signed that little piece of paper is the headmaster, the principal's room. You can go in it. It's really kind of wild. It's basically a secondary school, so you see a bunch of people your age walking around. All right, see you tomorrow. Yeah.